All right, folks. This segment is meant to it may be kind of boring for some of you. I don't know. Just meant to answer a couple questions and sort of fill in a little bit of the piece of the puzzle that we're trying to put together as to Maple Street's future. And so I'm going to and realizing that some of you are very familiar with this, and many of you are not. So just try to get us on a similar page as far as these issues are concerned, which I just said United Methodist property here, for lack of a better term. So I'm going to talk briefly, at least, about these four things: about the trust clause, member freedom, mergers, and independent disaffiliation. The actual, as many of you know, the United Methodist Church has what we call a book of discipline. It's our rule book, if you will. There are about 25. This is near the end, so there's about 2,500 paragraphs in it. Most of them have to do with administration and legal kinds of matters. Some about theological. But the one that that we want to focus on here is 2501, that all properties of the United Methodist local churches and other United Methodist agencies and institutions are held in trust for the benefit of the entire denomination, and ownership and usage of church property is subject to the discipline. The trust has always been irrevocable except as provided by the discipline. Property can be released from the trust under certain conditions. And local churches and other United Methodist churches, other United Methodist agencies and institutions may acquire, hold, maintain, improve, and sell property for purposes consistent with the mission of the church. So this instead is that while we are the legal agents of the Maple Street United Methodist Church property, that is not just the building but all of our other assets, the parking lot and our various funds and the contents of the building. Well, then that is held in trust by the denomination. Now, if that seems unfair, understand that was the way it always was, and it was always assumed and taken for granted, even when the country was founded and when churches were granted a kind of tax-exempt status. It was because no one individual church was an individual church. They were part of some kind of larger body and connection, even if they were Baptists or what have you. So even the Evangelical Association, which formed around in the early 1800s, and was the source of Andrew Schwartz, who came into this community in the 1870s and started churches out here. It was still understood that whatever was built was what belonged to the Evangelical Association. If it seems unfair, it probably gives us pause to remember that we didn't build this, and even if a family gave a significant amount of support, either manual labor or money, to the building of this or any other church property, that it wasn't just them, that there was support that came from a whole variety of places. Corey said to me before he left, I assume that you're born into a home. You don't know if your family owns it or if it's rented. It's just given whatever it is, and that was the understanding. So that's and from the denominational perspective, for not only United Methodist but other denominations, this was the way that they could assure control of the sort, because anytime you had a Methodist church, or for that matter a Presbyterian or other church, well, then you at least had some assurances that they weren't going to open a Methodist church one day and then decide to make it into a yoga studio or something like that the next day. That it was going to be consistent with the Methodist Church. So that's the bottom line. And whenever this has been challenged in court, the trust clause has always been upheld. That courts have always sided with the denomination in this regard. Now, there have been times where churches may have realized, particularly if they were carrying a lot of debt, that the conference may not, if they were threatening to leave or what have you, that the conference may not want to take the property because it's too much of a liability, and some churches left on that basis. Other churches left and then basically bought back the property, but they would have bought it presumably at market value. So, as a church, though the property does belong to the denomination, well then we're given a latitude on how to manage it. It is normal. It's a normal span of about any church to at some point to purchase, to sell, and then to purchase property, and maybe at some point even to sell that property so they can purchase larger property or something of that sort. Those things do require approval from the annual conference on behalf of the denomination. That is most of the time that is usually given freely unless there are reasons that they think it's not really in the church's best interest. For instance, a few years back, that when the church was looking to sell the parsonage at that time, when the housing market was so bad that the conference would not give their approval. But it was not because they wanted to stifle the church, it was because they thought it was going to be a bad decision for us. At that point, we would have sold it for less than what we owed on it. We would have continued to carry that debt. So, and then if we were to sell this property and then to move on to either buy or rent or something somewhere else, then the proceeds from the sale are restricted as capital funds. That is, they originally were part of a church building, and so they would be restricted for a new church building or some other part of the church's property. Okay, so number 2 then. Remember that as members, you have the freedom. The church may set up its own requirements for who is eligible for church membership. But once you become a member of a United Methodist Church, you are free to withdraw or transfer your membership at any time by request. Now, that isn't the same in all churches. In most churches, that's probably true, at least in this country. In cults, of course, as you know, it's not. You may have to do some extravagant things in order to get out. But here, if you want to leave, you can leave. That's always been the case. So in the event that a local church decides to close, what happens is that usually the leadership decides at some point that we should take a vote on this. They call a church conference, which means you have to give ample notice to everyone who is an official member of the church, even if they haven't been there for years, and even if they are way out of town. And then you have a vote, and a simple majority decides whether the church continues. And then all property, unless under special designation, for instance, if it was a designated gift for something that's not happening, that may have to be returned, or something else that's under designation. Everything reverts to the denomination under the care of the district board of church or location and building. Now, 3 cases that we might think of. Mills went through a closure like this. They went to they had a church conference, and then they had a vote, and then the people basically were released from their responsibilities to the church. Now, they might have helped to tie up some of the loose ends. And when I was with the church that closed, they owed money, including to me still. So they did try to sell off some things and stuff to raise the money to pay off the bills. But for the most part, they were able to leave it into the district's hands. Now, a second instance would be when the United Brethren Church on Pleasantville Road began. My understanding, although I don't know the full story, is that when there was the proposed merger in 1968 between the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren, there were members of that church that did not want any part of the merger. But the majority of EUB churches had voted for it, so they felt they were kind of stuck. But they didn't choose to close the church. They actually, a group of them simply withdrew their membership. They sort of left as a group and went and then went to and eventually had their new location on Pleasantville Road, and then established themselves as the United Brethren Church. So presumably then that left some people behind. Those people who still had now the authority of the church and continued to be part of it as the United Methodist Church. Then a further back case is the case of Maple Street themselves. Back in 1894, the Evangelical Association was going through its own kind of discord, and as far as I can see, that wasn't exactly a church closure either. That was a group of them met together at the Trinity Church on Main and Sterrett, and they determined that they were going to leave as a group, and they were going to join this other group of churches that were leaving that was called the United Evangelical Society. And in doing that, then they abandoned the property there, and they started the property across and got hold of the property across the street, and that's how Maple Street began. All right. Now another thing is when churches decide to merge, if two United Methodist churches decide to merge, and you've probably seen this or heard this because it's happened in a lot of places. It doesn't have to be just two. It could be multiple churches that may come together. The district superintendents do have to approve this, but normally there would be very little reason for them not to, and each church has to vote by majority to do this. So there have been instances I've heard of where there may have been 4 churches that voted to merge, and 2 or 3 of them voted yes, but the others voted no, so that the 2 or 3 then become a new church, and all property, again, except under special designation, continues with the successor church. So it's very common among United Methodist churches to do that. But there's also times where churches merge with a church of another denomination. You probably haven't seen that much here, although it might happen among some of the independent churches. But in our discipline, those are called federated churches. In order for that to happen, and that could be across about any denomination. If we wanted to merge with the Presbyterian Church, and I attended once a church that was a merged Methodist and Presbyterian church, that would have required approval from the appropriate bodies of both denominations, and it would have been a majority vote by each congregation, and the property continues with the successor church. Now, in some of those instances, because churches have different property rules, what typically happens is that's one of those places where the conference releases a church from the trust clause, either to go with the other church or some other designation. So it says that with the consent of the annual conference, you may instruct and direct the board of trustees of a local church to deed church property to a federated church. So this is one way that churches have sort of. I would say I don't think they've done it necessarily to escape being United Methodist, but in essence, by becoming a merged church with another denomination, they have stopped being the United Methodist Church, although they may still identify with that in their literature. Now, it does not say that they simply give the property over. That might actually happen in some cases. I know that there have been some cases in this conference, and unfortunately, the politics being what they are, it's hard for me to get information about how exactly the Upton Church in Toledo, for instance, as to their situation and how that was worked out. But this particular paragraph, particularly the second part of that paragraph, was one that churches were hoping to use as to disaffiliate, but it was ruled out of order. One, because there was the other paragraph that they did use, but here it says that the annual conference may instruct and direct the board of trustees of a local church to deed church property to one of the other denominations represented in the Pan Methodist Commission or to another evangelical denomination under an allocation, exchange of property, or comity agreement. And these agreements are done by the Council of Bishops. So I've looked at this question about, okay, so what are these other evangelical denominations that they're talking about? That's another place I can't quite get a straight answer, but there's at least a few guesses that I know would be included. The reason that the disaffiliation process was that they were told they couldn't use this to disaffiliate, presumably it might have been a less expensive way for churches to leave the denomination with their property, but because the global Methodist Church is not one of those evangelical denominations, not because it may be someday, but because the Council of Bishops have to agree that it is one, and the General Conference has to approve that, and they came into existence without a General Conference to approve them, if that makes sense. It's all a matter of timing in that sense. But the churches that they're talking about, the Pan Methodist Commission refers to 6 churches, the United Methodist Church being one, and the other 5 churches that are on the list here, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. There is one of those here, Allen Chapel, that's here in Lancaster. And then the AME Zion, the Christian Methodist, and a couple others that I hadn't even heard of before that are much smaller. The numbers there are the number of million members. Those are the Pan Methodist Commission, and then there's a couple other churches that the United Methodist Church has entered into what they call full communion. That is, that we could actually that from the Evangelical Lutheran Church, that we could actually do appointments. I could actually request to be appointed to a Lutheran church, although they have a call process, so they'd have to approve me, and we could have a Lutheran pastor here. And there is a process. It's not quite complete, likewise with the Episcopal Church. So I bring this up as these are denominations which the church could have a relationship with, and certainly with a merger would in effect be allowed to take the church property out of the United Methodist Church and into one of these. In addition to that, I'm sure that other churches that are part of the World Methodist Council, the World Methodist Council, about 40 million members, but it is churches throughout the world, and in the United States there are the Methodist churches that we'd already mentioned, but also the Church of the Nazarene, the Free Methodist Church, and the Wesleyan Church. Those are all part of the World Methodist Council. So I would assume that it would be a fairly good bet that they are also on that list of other evangelical denominations, and others that may be possibly on that list, but for historical connections would be the United Brethren Church, which split off before the United Brethren became EUB, and the Evangelical Congregational Church, which is the churches that were part of Maple Street's denomination, when they split from the evangelicals, they became the United Evangelical Society. But the ones that didn't go back to the evangelicals stayed separate as the Evangelical Congregational Church. So that paragraph in the discipline really is talking about a couple of different things. One is if you merge across denominations, then there's little controversy about moving property into either that denomination or depending on how they structure their property. That doesn't mean that it's free. I don't have a sense of where there would be cost. There would probably be some kind of agreement to cost, but it presumably would be minimal. The other possibility would be if a church wants to actually join one of these other denominations. For instance, there are no evangelical congregational churches in Lancaster. The nearest ones are, I think there's one in Northeast Ohio, and there's some in Pennsylvania. And if we were, so in an instant like that, well, then we could say that we are joining this denomination as the Maple Street Church. But in order to do that, of course, we would have to make the case to that denomination that we were going to be a station for them. So we would have to get their approval. So when we look at mergers, of course, we're looking at the time-consuming process of actually building a relationship with another church or another denomination. So that leaves us with a few options. I mean, obviously, one is that we can continue as we are and we can retain our property as the United Methodist Church. Another option is that we can abandon either by the members withdrawing, although that's usually going to leave some members here, or we could vote to close and then reorganize and either repurchase this property or purchase or rent other property. Or another option is to seek an arrangement with another denomination, and the last is to merge with another church. Now there have been church mergers and many of them have not worked out very well because there are bad reasons for merging, but just as there may be bad reasons for churches disaffiliating. If it's a matter of just consolidating the property, that's a pretty bad reason. Or keeping things the same as long as possible. There have been mergers. I know that, in fact, one of my churches was actually approached by another that was looking into a possible merger. But of course, they wanted us to move into their building and basically just help them to keep the lights on for a few more years. And as some of you may know, that some churches who have disaffiliated from the United Methodist Church are doing well, and others not doing so well. And that's probably because the decision by itself is not enough. If it's just a matter of consolidating our property or keeping things the same, then it's not going to be a good decision either way. But there are good reasons. One is to remember that we're not the only Christians called to this community. That Christ calls beyond denominations, and the labels indeed can be a hindrance. As I said earlier, that when something happens in a TV church or the Roman Catholic Church, it does negatively impact Christians everywhere. But ultimately, the reason for merging is a vision for the future that resonates with one or more churches. So it seems to me that one of the important steps in a process of visioning for our future is to look at what are our connections to other churches now. When I first arrived here, Rick Jones and I was 6th Avenue and had some conversation with Brian Jones also at first, and we did start to have some meetings together. We also invited, now her name's escaping me, from Mills, but but we never could get her into a meeting. But we had discussions with some members. We actually had a meeting where some of the lay people from Sixth especially met with us. And that was all right. We did that for a little bit, but that was kind of driven by us as pastors. One of the things that I discovered in my previous appointment in Columbus was that as the churches had worked together, they realized that they knew a lot of the members of other churches. A lot of them were high school alumni together. They had other places where they met together, and so there were some natural connections. And one of the things then that I would ask you is to say, well, I know that you know people from other churches around here, and are there things at least that we could be doing together? The Revival Hire things that I've been involved with are another avenue for that. But again, that's coming from pastors trying to connect with one another. Whenever you approach another church, of course, we can't just say, well, we want to merge with you. There was actually some talk that there were some people in Mills who were actually talking about doing that, but they never came to us directly. But doing joint events, doing trainings, having classes together, some ways may help us to open our eyes to the ways that God may be using not only Maple Street, but using Maple Street in addition to some of the other churches. So the bottom line in all of this is that the property it's an issue, and I hope that what I've said is understandable. I can try to answer any questions afterwards, but that's kind of just the shell of what we're doing. I mean, the real meat of our future is about our vision for the future. What do we believe that God is calling us to? And that may well, and I've tried to leave no stone unturned, I guess, in the instance of being open to what that means. I have a vow and a commitment to the United Methodist Church, but ultimately my commitment is, my ultimate commitment is to where my Lord is leading me, and as well as I assume that it should be to you. So I encourage you to pray, but one piece of that I want to recommend that, and if you want to pray in this space, at this time, to think about how God may be using not only us, but some of our neighbor churches here, and we can be a part of that. Any questions?